So I think the plan for today, I wanted to talk about my origin story. So I'm very interested in the kind of combination of code and design. Um, I'm a I am a designer by my training, my schooling. I went to design school, but I spend most of my time, designing in code. And I love that intersection of from thinking about design in code to the tools and software and stuff that's available. Um, I think there historically has been a big kind of divide between. Let's go to clean. Let's go to the main camera clean. Let's take that crap off. Okay. I think historically there's been like a pretty big divide between design and development. These two kind of silos where designers they're in their software like Figma or Sketch, and they spend their time there and they create all their assets, etc. And then there's kind of a handoff process, and then it gets sent over to development, and the developers kind of implement based on as much information it was kind of encoded in that whatever that handoff was. And I talked about this recently in a YouTube video. There's definitely been a lot of tools to help improve this. Figma has made some really interesting updates to their software to kind of give developers like their own viewport into the design file. I think that's awesome, for sure. But could it be better? Or I guess the way I think about it is like, should, I don't know. The question that's been on my mind a lot lately, and was the topic of that YouTube video that I just mentioned. Should designers code? And I tend to be on the side of, and I don't think it's for all designers, but I think there's a lot of designers that would be awesome, writing code, designing, being a part of the the production code or the development code, part of the repo, doing all the fine finessing of all the design details that typically happens in Figma, but I think they would be just as efficient, potentially, it's my theory, would be just as efficient doing all of that inside of a text editor in code, in repo. Anyway, that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about today is like how I got here. I don't know if it's that interesting, but it's just kind of, I don't know, when I reflect back on what led me down this path. Honestly, like, I think at first we talk about design because that's what kind of came first for me. So my earliest, how did I get into design? My earliest memories that I think are ever so slightly related to this, or maybe really kind of fundamental to my path into design, was I have this really early memory of, so my mom, she did some accounting work when my brother and I were young. She worked for a company, I can't remember who it was, and it's really not important, but she did accounting work, and I remember going to this store. It was a store where it was, this was in the 80s, probably early 80s. And it was like, I guess, a store for like accountants or like bookkeepers, I guess. And I just remember walking through the store. She had to go pick up, and this was, computers were certainly around back then, but, a lot of spreadsheets and stuff. There was still a lot of people who did it, I guess, manually in physical books. And these books were, they were big, and they kind of laid flat, and they just had basically blank lines, like a spreadsheet, and then you would handwrite stuff in. But I just remember being, I gotta hide this. This is very distracting. Hide a little more. So sorry. So, but I just remember walking around this this store, and there were just all kinds of, these, like I said, these books with just all these, really detailed just lines, right? These, I wish I could, and maybe I'll find some imagery of the types of books and stuff that I'm thinking about. It's just very intricate, just beautiful. It was just like all these blank pages, and you just like, it was just, I don't know, there was just something about it that I just loved. And then there was all these other things like, forms, order forms, invoice, like all these just like blank. Again, this is like everyone had a computer. So all this stuff, you would go into a store and like you'd buy a new TV, and they'd have to handwrite, the invoice or the receipt. And a lot of these forms had carbon copy parts to them. So it would be like, 2 or more sheets, and then in between each sheet that you wanted a copy, so you didn't have to write it multiple times. It had a piece of what was called like carbon paper, and it basically just like left the imprint onto the next page below it. And I think you could probably have 3 or 4 sheets with a carbon sheet in between each one. Anyway, I just remember so distinctly, and the smell of it, you could like, the carbon sheet, there was just something about that I just fell in love with. I thought it was so cool. And I remember my mom, she bought me, it wasn't like anything you want, but she let me pick something out that she would let me take home. And the thing I picked out, it was so weird, and I kept it for years. But I'm pretty sure it was like it was a small pad for like a waiter or waitress at a restaurant would have. So it was just, a blank form with some lines, and probably had like, like where you'd write maybe the description or the food item, and then a price, and then maybe like a couple lines at the bottom for like tax and total and all that stuff and tip. And I just thought it was so cool. And I just remember I took it home, and I would just write stuff on it, and I didn't really know what I was doing. It didn't really matter. But it was just, that is when I think of like my earliest memory in anything that kind of put me on this path for design. It was definitely, that comes to mind. Maybe there were other things earlier than that, and that was in the early 80s. So I was probably, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years old, maybe 6 years old, 7 years old. I don't know. But so there was that. And then fast forward, probably not too much later. So my dad, he sold commercial printing paper. That was his career. He did very well at it. He loved it. But so the company where he worked, they had what was called a sample room. So and it's hard to imagine because, especially today, if you just think of paper, you think of, white copier paper, a paper you buy for your, printer at home or whatever. And certainly you can imagine that on a commercial scale. If you know anything about commercial printing, there's, large presses that print on these huge sheets, and they go anyway, I don't get into printing, but so he sold commercial printing paper. They had the sample room, and this was where paper manufacturers, they would create and there's, maybe I'll find some imagery to kind of fill in here as well, but they would create there were kind of 2 kinds of samples. One would just be like a swatch book for different types of paper, different colors, different thicknesses, different textures, etc. And those were very interesting. I loved those. But then they would also do some of the most amazing design and photography. They would create this stuff, and they would print it on their paper. These, paper manufacturers they'd hire designers and photographers to do really interesting stuff, and they'd print it on their paper to be a sample, a piece to kind of market to, like, look how good your photographs could look on this paper. Anyway, I used to love going into that sample room and just, it was huge. It was just packed. It was, probably like a 20 by 20 room, and it was just packed full of these samples. And I loved it. I just loved going in there and just just looking at it and the tactile nature of paper, just in these, these swatch books, they would just have like all these like strips of paper, and it would get like smaller, or it'd start at smaller and get bigger, and it had this kind of like overlay effect. It was so cool. In fact, well, I don't have anything close by, but anyway, the sample room, that was another early memory that I think got me into design. I mean, that was really like, that was the thing that really got me to know that design was a thing. Graphic design. That's kind of what I went to school for, graphic design, or what I went, the classes that I took was for visual communications. I have an associate's degree from a small community college here in Dayton called Sinclair Community College. But that was kind of the intro to visual communications or graphic design, graphic artists. And I loved it. I fell in love with it. Some other memories, kind of in between those events, or those memories that I have. I kind of got into art a little bit. I remember for a birthday present one year, well, actually, let me back up. I was a huge fan of, and who wasn't, a huge fan of Bob Ross. I used to love to watch him paint, probably like on Saturday mornings. He'd be on our local PBS, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And then one year for my birthday, my parents got me a set of oil paints and some canvases and a couple books on learning how to paint. And I loved it. And I actually got pretty good at it. I don't know. Yeah, I was pretty decent at it. And my parents would put those paintings around the house, and I enjoyed that. And even, when I was in high school, I obviously took art. Probably it was my freshman year. Ironically, I failed that class just because I was an idiot when it came to school, especially at that age. But my art teacher, he noticed that I was pretty good, and he always encouraged me. Throughout my high school career, he encouraged me to take more art classes. But at some point early on, I just kind of wrote off art as being not that interesting or not that cool, I guess. And I just never really thought to pursue it. I kind of wish I would have, looking back in hindsight. But, so art was, definitely a part of, I wasn't great. I was okay. I've always kind of had this thing when it comes to art where I would only be interested to see if I was any good. If I was drawing something, I would get to the point where I was like, okay, I'm like not too bad at this. And then I would just kind of finish. I wouldn't finish. I would just kind of like stop whatever the project was there. I had a friend, neighbor, who was actually a very good artist, and he, I always appreciated watching him draw stuff and all the stuff that he came up with. And then I would kind of imitate it, and I'd be like, okay, yeah, I can kind of do that. And I had a hard time finishing, drawings and stuff. I do remember there was an art project or an art contest that I got either first or second place in. We were supposed to draw. It was something related to drugs. Just say no, or I don't know. And my drawing was something. It was like a kid sitting under a tree. I remember at the time it seemed so cool. I thought I had the greatest idea ever. It was about getting high, and the headline or the thing that I wrote was like, I don't know, like getting high is cool, but everything that goes up must come down. And the kid under the tree was like hungover or whatever. But I didn't really fully understand what that was all about, probably. But that was back in the early days of Dare, DARE. which I can't even remember. I'm pretty sure it was an acronym that I don't really remember what that was about. But yeah, so that was those are kind of the early memories that that in some way led to whatever made me want to be, or it made me appreciate some level of art and design. And like I said earlier, I was a terrible student. I didn't really want to go to school. But after graduating high school, I felt like I should. That's kind of what you do. You graduate high school, you go to college. That was just kind of the expectation. I went to the local community college, took classes, realized that you didn't have to show up. There was no one there that was going to, call your parents if you didn't show up. You were kind of an adult, or at least treated like an adult. So I just didn't go to class. I failed. I failed out. I got kicked out. And I was totally fine with that, because then I went from there. I went to go sell cars at a Ford dealership in town, and I thought that was the coolest thing. Kind of I don't want to go into my appreciation for cars, but at that age, and I still like cars a lot, but just being around brand new cars and being able to drive them off the lot, it was very cool. I thought that would be I thought that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And this was in the early 2000s, and when I'm selling cars, and in that time, the internet really started to become a tool for consumers, learning about the products that they're going to buy, etc. And it became really kind of a whole new. It really changed the car industry. I'm sure it changed tons of industries, obviously, but the car industry, kind of before probably the early 2000s, I think, and they were kind of notorious for this. The car industry, the dealerships, not the car industry as a whole, but certainly the dealerships, the car sales experience. I think a lot of dealers really, really manipulated the buyers and would make a lot of money by selling cars. Probably way more. There wasn't I guess what I'm trying to say is the consumers didn't have a lot of information to maybe bring solid negotiating information or tactics to bargain on buying a car, which is kind of weird that was the way it was and kind of still is today. But anyway, so I was selling cars, not particularly good at it. I kind of hated it, other than hanging out with my friends who also worked there and driving cool cars and being around cool cars. I like that. But it was the web was kind of becoming a thing, and I wanted to build or maintain or work on, do stuff for the website for our dealership. And then there was also, there would be sales leads that would come in through our website, and it was just kind of a title, but I got put in charge of all that, and I was like the internet sales manager or what it was. Again, it didn't really help my career, in at least not in car sales, but it got me really interested in the web, and it made me want to go back to school for basically web design. And the college that I got kicked out of, that I failed out of, the community college, they had a program. It was just like a certificate. It was like a web design certificate. It was, I don't know, took maybe 6 months or a year to get, that I looked into. And I tried to get into that program, and they said no, because you failed out. And I remember I had to petition and write a letter and to the president of the college, and do all this kind of jumping through hoops to get back in, and they let me in. They let me take one class. My first class that I took was it was Typography 101 or Intro to Typography or something like that. And I had an amazing teacher, Cynthia Cawley. She was awesome. Very difficult teacher, but she was so good for that class. And I think a lot of people, that was their favorite teacher that went through the program at least in that era. But I fell in love with design, not just web design. But it was, I really loved the class, and I got an A, or maybe a B. I don't know. But I got a good grade. It was like the first good grade I got in college. And then that just kind of led to, okay, the next, semester or quarter or whatever it was, took a couple more classes and got good grades. And, and that, I just kept going, and I got a degree, in visual communications. I graduated in 2004, I think June of 2004. So that, I graduated later than the rest of my high school graduating class. I was a couple years late, a couple years delayed, because I went and sold cars. But anyway, so that's kind of how I got into design, I guess. And during my visual communications classes, there was and again, this is early days. This is 2002 probably when I took this class, but I took like an intro to, or I think what did they call it? Multimedia or web, but there was a very short period. I don't even think it was for the whole class, but we learned, web design and how, I wouldn't call it web development, but we used Dreamweaver, and we learned how to build really simple websites. And this is back in the day where, if you're a student of design history or web design history or web development history, we built websites out of tables. Anyway, I don't want to get into all those details, but yeah, so I built a website and loved all that. But I didn't necessarily see web design as the thing that I wanted to do specifically. I was in love with design and branding and typography. So yeah, that's what I wanted to do. So I graduated. I got my first job. I think maybe about a year after I graduated. Because at that time I was, I wanted a job. I definitely wanted a job. I kind of toyed with this idea of being a freelance designer. I had met some freelance designers that were very successful, and I thought that was very cool. But I was bartending and waiting tables and stuff and having fun doing that. So I finally got my first job. It was for a design agency, a very small agency that it's kind of an interesting story. And I don't know if I want to go into all the details about how I got the job and the origin of the agency, but short story. So they worked inside Huffy Corporation, like for Huffy bikes. And I got a job here, and I was actually, my desk was inside of Huffy, inside their corporate building, also here in Dayton, Ohio. And I got to design bike graphics and a decent amount of packaging for like smaller bikes and scooters and stuff. And I, for years I designed bike graphics, and that was an amazing experience. And it was, amazing for so many reasons. But it was so cool as a brand new designer out of school, working on a project, and then, walking into a Target or Walmart and seeing your bike that you designed up there on the shelf. It was so cool. So cool. Um, funny story. I was at it might have been a Dick's or Target or something, Dick's Sporting Goods, and I was there. I would, in those years, I would always go back to the bike section and just see what other bikes were out there, and see if any of the bikes that I had designed were there. And sure enough, there was one of my bikes. It was like a grandparents were there buying it for their grandson or granddaughter. And it was a bike that I had designed, and I kind of told them that, hey, I actually designed the graphics for that. And they asked me to sign they came with like a little manual, and I signed it. I signed it for them. It was, I don't know. It was interesting. But so yeah, that was my design school and kind of my first job. At that job, obviously I was designing bike graphics, and then later, that agency grew a bit, and we started taking on other clients, and I did other types of projects, but still mostly on the branding and page layout and designing posters and all that kind of stuff. Still wasn't doing a whole lot for the web. Until a little bit later, we started to take on a few web projects, but we weren't really competent, so we would work with other agencies that would help us, kind of execute the development part. We would be in charge of the design part. And that kind of continued. But then I also remember we were designing the website for the agency, and we brought in one of my friends, a guy that I graduated high school with, who was a web developer or web front end developer. And I remember this moment. It was like the first time I kind of understood like what code was, and it wasn't really code. I guess it was. It wasn't. It was just understanding HTML and CSS. And he gave me kind of a demo of, how HTML and CSS works. And it just it was the first time oh my gosh, that actually makes sense. Okay. So you have these tags, and then there's a class, and you have a class name, and then that name in your CSS represents, these styles over here. And it was the first time I understood, oh, so that's kind of what code is. It's like, there's kind of a language. You have to kind of know the language. And then you use these things, these abstract names that represent these other things that are, that handle some level of complexity, over here, whatever. But that was like the first click in my head of, okay, that kind of makes sense. That's cool. So kind of moving on, and nothing really happened. It's not like I got into, continuing that process too much, but it definitely was it's a point in my mind, or a point in time that I remember starting to learn, okay, or having at least an understanding of okay, I somewhat understand HTML and CSS. And then let's see, fast forward a little bit later. So I left that job and pursued being a freelancer. And I was able to find success and do that pretty well for a good number of years. It was a great decision. And in that process, especially when you're on your own and you're not really sure where your next paycheck's going to come from, you just learn to say yes to a lot of different projects. So that was kind of the norm for me. But so maybe back up a little bit. So in that early days, again, this is now probably, I don't know, maybe 2009. I think I started my freelance in 2009, 2010. And I would take on web design projects for clients. And the way that I think a lot of people did it, a lot of designers would do it this way. They had what we called chop shops. But it was, they would take so the design tool of choice was Photoshop. For me, there were other, like Fireworks. There were other tools out there. Some people used Illustrator, but I used Photoshop. A lot of designers designed for the web in those days, and this is before, I guess 2009. No, the iPhone came out in 2007. So, but this was in the early days. Responsive web design was not really a thing, but it was mostly you would design, 1280 by whatever would be your screen size, and you design just kind of a static layout for all the different pages in Photoshop. And I remember Photoshop had things like, smart layers, and it would kind of allow you to create things that you would have consistently across different screens. And anyway, I used to love designing in Photoshop, and then you would hand it off to, you would hire a company, or really it was like PSD to HTML.com was one. And you would upload your Photoshop document, and then they would turn that into, CSS, HTML and CSS, or maybe a WordPress template. That was another, especially in those days, that was a big part of building web pages, small websites for clients. WordPress was the back end a lot. And that was just kind of the process. And then, so I guess fast forward a little bit, still in that process, maybe you would have PSD to HTML generate one page, and that would give you enough where you could maybe kind of fumble around and figure out how to duplicate that into another page, make some minor changes, and you do a little Googling, figure out how to do something in code. Let's see, where are we going here? So early days designing web pages, Photoshop. Someone else would do most of the hard work into creating the HTML and CSS. And then, actually, another kind of point in the story, where I learned programming, there was a plugin for WordPress that kind of introduced me to logic and loops, while loops and for each loops. And I won't go too much into that, but that was, it was a GUI, it was a graphical user interface that allowed you to create, some logic. And I think you would use drop downs, and you would make your selections, and then it would produce some code that you could then copy and paste that code into a WordPress template. But that was, again, I wasn't maybe savvy enough to write all that stuff out in a code editor, but it got my mind to start to understand coding, programming, logic, and whatnot. So that was cool. And then let's see, where did it go from there? So I think, I kind of mentioned the iPhone earlier, but there was, in the early days of the iPhone with the App Store, and it was you just saw all these stories of, developers creating apps for the App Store, and, rags to riches, or just overnight millionaires. And I was fascinated by that. I think a lot of people were. And I realized that in order to do that, you have to learn how to program. You have to learn all this stuff. And so I wanted to learn. I thought, maybe go back to school, but there's a lot of information out there online for free. And I distinctly remember, iTunes University. That was in iTunes. It was just free content that a lot of universities would put out. And it would be, mostly it was 101 classes, 102 classes, I think, if I recall. But there was an introduction to iOS development. And I was like, oh, dude, I want to learn this so easy. I'm going to learn this. Let's do it. And back then, that was when iOS was Objective-C, and building layouts and stuff. It was I couldn't figure it out. Like I watched these classes, like okay, like beyond like anything beyond like the first class, it just I couldn't understand what they were talking about, and that's when I realized like they're assuming you have an understanding of like some fundamental computer programming skills, which I just didn't have, short of what I maybe understood from the WordPress plugin. Maybe that WordPress stuff, maybe that came later. So I found myself I kept saying like, "Ooh, I gotta dig a little bit deeper." So I would take like Intro to Computer Programming 101 or whatever, and I still didn't feel satisfied. I remember going all the way back, like what are computers? Like how does this all work? I wanted like a mental model of like how it all worked. And I remember watching again, I think it was on iTunes U, but it was like a very intro to like just computer. I don't remember what the class was, but it was breaking it all the way down to like switches and binary, and how can computers do all this stuff when the only thing that you have to operate is like switches? And it's like, well, you have a switch that has two states, on and off, and then you put two switches together. You got on, you've got two switches, so you can have on, off, and every combination. I won't bore you with all that, and it's like, okay, and then you can have 4, 6, 8, whatever. You have a group of these switches, and you can start to put together, okay, well, this combination is a represents 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so you can have numbers and then letters and all that, and then you just kind of understand, okay, all right, I couldn't write in binary, but at least now I have a basic understanding of like, okay, that helps. And I, on and off for a couple years, I would get really excited, and I'd have an idea for an iOS app, and I try to learn, and I just couldn't grok it. I could not figure it out. But I guess, all the while I was maybe picking up tiny little details that were maybe starting to paint a picture in my head, and I was learning, I guess. But then I came across, I don't know. But before I talk about that, I guess PHP was kind of the language that maybe I had the most experience. I didn't really know what PHP was, or I couldn't compare it to any other maybe programming language. But I definitely was at least comfortable enough because I had seen PHP. I had copied and pasted stuff in and out of WordPress templates, etc. So I was kind of comfortable with PHP. I wouldn't say comfortable. I was familiar with it. Anyway, so then I came across. I don't remember precisely how I got there, but I was learning. Actually, no. I gotta go back a little bit, because there was another fundamental point. Learning kind of front end design, and this is pre learning PHP, but learning more about HTML and CSS, and that happened when I distinctly remember the moment. I'm watching a video. It was Chris Coyier, who famously made CSS Tricks and CodePen and some other stuff and podcasts and whatnot. But he had a presentation he gave. I think it was like, I don't know, some local meetup or something like that. But he talked about like to be a modern web developer or web designer, what are the tools? And he introduced me to, not directly, but like in this talk, he talked about Sass. which what does it stand for? Syntactically awesome style sheets, I think. But it was, I don't know who's all listening to this, but Sass was a kind of it was like CSS, but it had some logic built in and variables and things that are kind of now in CSS. But it was before all that stuff existed in CSS. But it made your CSS so more powerful, and it was a pre-processed language, so it would you would still ship CSS, but you could write in this kind of new CSS-like language to do stuff, very interesting stuff that you couldn't do with CSS. Anyway, so that was another step into, learning Sass. As weird as that sounds, it was a great introduction to understanding like loops and variables and stuff like that. And that was really powerful. And that allowed me to, again, like going back and thinking about in Photoshop, drawing pictures and sending it to PSD to HTML or any other, chop shop as we called them. It was when I started to, I would still kind of sketch things out in Illustrator or Photoshop, but I would very quickly just kind of go over to, what was I using back then? Sublime Text, maybe. But I would have a text editor and a browser window open, and I would just be writing HTML and CSS and then saving and refreshing in live reload, and then you would see your design would be in the browser, and it was like, well, I don't need Photoshop anymore. Because in those days that was when like CSS3 came out, and you had border radius and box shadows and all this stuff that you could do in Photoshop, you could now do it in CSS, and was just like, this is amazing. Like, I don't need Photoshop anymore. And then that introduced me to like, just the power of a text editor, like multiple cursors and like multiple select and find and replace, just all the different things you can do in a text editor. It was just, I loved it. I was it was like that sweet spot in my brain for like design and this development, this other side of my brain that was like organizing things and logic and thinking about all that. So that was definitely a pivotal part. So shout out to Chris Coyier. And then from there, it's like I learned so much watching, Chris Coyier and being on his, CSS Tricks website. Spent a lot of time there, so I learned a lot. So let's see. So yeah, and then I think I kind of continued on. And I remember some other ideas that I wanted to build, not just, static websites or, WordPress sites for clients. I wanted to build, I had ideas for stuff I wanted to build, real life websites. Something where you'd have, like forms and inputs and get information from users and user accounts and logins and all that kind of, I wanted to build stuff like that. I had this idea for an app. At the time, I was playing a lot of beach volleyball, and I wanted to build an app that helped kind of facilitate like pickup and maybe even like sports leagues and whatever. So I wanted to build a project around that, and that's when I came across Laravel. So Laravel, if you don't know, it's a framework. It's built on PHP. And it has an amazing community, but it's a framework to just it's kind of like, Ruby on Rails. Rails is, on the Ruby language, I think Laravel kind of mimics a lot of what Ruby did, for PHP. And it's an amazing framework, but it's got an amazing community around it. And there's just so much information out there that even, this was years ago. This was, I was like Laravel, either 5 or 6. And they're on like 10 now. But anyway, so I started to consume, and it was actually Laracast. Jeffrey White. I mean, I just consumed a bunch. I got an account. I paid account, and I just started learning as much as I could about Laravel. And I got to the point where I'm building these little apps, these little CRUD apps, CRUD. And I guess to kind of fast forward to today, it's like, I'm not a programmer. I'm not a developer per se, but I'm definitely, I kind of straddle this, design development, career, and I spend most of my day in a text editor and inside, Git and, in a text editor and a browser, and I do most of my design in there. And I write some, front end code, obviously, and some back end stuff. And anyway, that's kind of how I got to where I am, and I'm happy where I'm at. I wish I was a better programmer. I kind of wish that I had the knowledge of, a 4-year like computer science degree. I think it'd be powerful, but I don't. That's okay, and I keep kind of continue to learn. I'm actually working on a project in React, which I kind of hated for a long time. I really hated React, especially coming from Laravel. It seemed so foreign to me. But I'm starting to embrace that a little bit. I kind of like React. I like certain parts of it. Still hate certain parts of it. But anyway, I don't know. That's kind of my origin story. That's to where I am here in January of 2024. And yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to kind of talk through that. It was kind of fun to go through all those kind of key points in my mind of what led me to where I am today. But yeah, that is my origin story. And I don't know. I might. I'm just, part of it's just being the new year, but I've always kind of wanted to, I think back to Chris Coyier and how much information I got from the content that he put out. I mean, he still puts out a lot of content, but like I learned so much from him, and I just feel like, huge, like, thank you to Chris and people like Chris who put the time and effort and energy into putting together content for YouTube, or putting together talks that are then recorded and put out in the world. And I've done a very tiny bit of that, and I enjoy it. I kind of enjoy the process of like putting stuff out there, kind of putting your 2 cents out into the world. I think is a powerful kind of feeling, but also just to kind of give back in a way that I don't know. I feel so thankful for all the people that put out information that it's just, I've gained just an immense amount of information about a bunch of knowledge, and I love it. So this is just my kind of attempt to kind of get into, but anyway, so yeah, it's 2024, it's January. I get excited this time of year. I wanted to start doing maybe something a little new. So I'm thinking, some YouTube content. I'll put some stuff out like this. I do like, and I think it's probably the most useful for people is, tutorials, how to do stuff. I think I'm going to put some videos together for kind of aimed at Figma users, people who spend all their day in Figma that are maybe curious about trying to learn how to code. I want to put some like a course, or, put some stuff together for that. Yeah, you can find me on, this is on YouTube, probably. This will be on YouTube. You can find me on YouTube at No More Design, KNOW, No More Design. Yeah, just, you can find me on most social medias at Nathan Gross. I'm kind of around. I don't put a whole lot of stuff out there, or, historically I haven't, but I certainly want to. And I'm kind of on the path to do so. I mean, again, it's only January, and we'll see if I'm able to do this. But anyway, I might put this out as a podcast. I don't know. I don't know. Kind of like sitting here talking, but I might run out of ideas. Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, wherever you are, like, subscribe, those kind of things. I know you keep hearing people say this, but like, it does help kind of promote the channels and it helps people understand, or it helps give feedback to the content creators that like, hey, this is interesting. Hey, please keep doing this. Yeah. So I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, thank you for listening. I'm going to go ahead and shut this one down. And if I see you in the next one, I would appreciate it. All right. Ciao. Ciao. What? I mean, is that what I say? Ciao. All right. Shut her down.